I'm going to continue in my reading of the standard works, but I am moving on, or moving back, to the book of Ether. And before I read anymore, I want to do this very brief video to kind of help us orient Ether into the history of the world and how it fits in or relates to the rest of the scriptures. Now, in my previous readings, I have read the first 7 chapters of Ether to refresh our memories. There's the brother of Jared and his brother, and they leave at the time of the Tower of Babel. They pray to God that their languages are not confounded, them and their families and their friends, totaling 22 people. They all band together into a group, and they head out at the Tower of Babel. Now, according to the book of Jasher, which I have referenced many times in these videos, the Tower of Babel occurred when Abraham was about 50 years old. Now, I think, given what information is in the Bible, it is very likely that it would have been around that time. Abraham was probably alive at the event of the Tower of Babel, which means that Jared and his brother are contemporaries of Abraham. Now, in the Bible, we have the generations of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, 4 generations. In the book of Ether, we have Jared, Orihah, Kib, and Shul, 4 generations. Now, that's as far as we got in our reading, going through chapter 7. We ended chapter 7 with the rule of Shul, right? So that is where we're at. If you recall the basic overview of what has happened in Ether, they left at the Tower of Babel. They traveled through the wilderness. You may recall I mentioned the Tower of Babel is probably also when the continents were divided. It is likely that it was all one event, but it was also likely that the continents didn't just into where they're currently at. They probably drifted slowly. Probably took them a number of years to reach their current positions. The Jaredites went, as far as I can tell, to the east, traveled across Asia, crossed the Pacific Ocean in the famous barges, and they were on the water for almost a year before they reached the Americas. It is likely, in my opinion, that at this time the Pacific Ocean was much wider and the Atlantic Ocean was much narrower, as the continents had only very recently divided, and the American continents most likely would have split off of the western edge of Europe and Africa. And so they're slowly drifting west before they settle in their current position. Probably took a few years. I don't think it took millions of years. This was over the course of one generation. They moved. I don't think it was in a couple of days. I don't think it was in a few seconds. I think it was a massive, there was obviously a massive earthquake. You can't split continents without shaking the earth a bit. But the drifting of the continents probably took a little while. So while Abraham is having all of his adventures, Jared and his brother travel across Asia. They sail across the Pacific Ocean, and they live their lives over there. About the time that Isaac takes over, that Abraham dies, and Isaac becomes the patriarch, that's about the same time that Jared and his brother die, and Orihah becomes king. Now, Orihah reigns very well. No wars in his lifetime. And his son, Kib, who it says he begat in his old age, became king. Now, you'll note this little note here I may have forgotten to mention is that in Ether it does seem that it's not the oldest son that becomes king. It's a younger son, one that is begotten in their old age. So we have that. So Kib probably became king not when Isaac died and Jacob took over as being patriarch, although possibly Jacob was 77 when he met Rachel and Leah. So I mean Isaac lived for about another 50 years after that, but so it was about the age of, you could say about the time that Isaac died, probably, and Jacob takes over, Kib becomes king. And it's in Kib's lifetime that we have a division of the kingdom. His son takes over, puts him in captivity. Then Shul, who is, again, begotten in Kib's old age, is born, takes the battle to Shul, takes the country back over, and then Shul becomes king. We have another civil war with Shul's nephew, but eventually it all reunites into a single kingdom. By the time that this is reuniting and Shul is now in his old age and getting ready to die, this is the beginning. This is when the Israelites are now in Egypt. This is, as I mentioned before, there's about 150 years that the Israelites are in Egypt that we don't have any scriptural record of. That is the time period that we are now going to be reading of in the book of Ether. When I get into Ether, that is where chronologically we are lining up. And one of the greatest Jaredite kings is who we're going to be reading about. So just during that 150, somewhere in that time period, as we read the next few chapters of Ether, that is where we will be in the chronology. So I think it's important, not vitally, but I think it's good that we are able to line up the timelines, that we are able to see how things are moving along. So I'm not going to be actually reading it right now. My next video will be Ether chapter 8. But I wanted to put this out there. I wanted to make this clear. I wanted to line up the timeline. And if my computer was working properly, I'd put a whole timeline up on the top of the screen that would put all these things in order for you. But it's just Jared and his brother are contemporary to Abraham. Orihah, the first king of the Jaredites, is the generation of Isaac. Kib is the generation of Jacob. And Shul was the generation of Joseph. We are now moving past Shul, and therefore we are moving into that 150 years that the Israelites were in Egypt. That is the same time period we are looking at as we continue in Ether.